It's been a really hard 2 years. The only way I can describe is that, we've been managing through a lot of different things. The dynamic is new, living at home, working from home, um, exploring how that would work. A lot of people, I would say, never had that experience before. And so, for me, it was how do I get up, go to work, and not feel like I'm at home? Or how do I manage my kids that had Zoom meetings for school, and yet I still had the same exact time of meetings in Zoom as well? And having to go out and manage that at the same time as my work, or the noise that was in the background. So the timing was there. My environment, luckily, I was in Texas, and we have quite a bit of room, but I felt for my colleagues that were up in New York in a studio apartment, and they were by themselves. And that's a whole different dynamic. That's a dynamic of loneliness and of feeling maybe even claustrophobic. And we all went through this. So this was really a novel time for everybody. But we are at a point in time as well where we get to make a choice. We get to decide whether or not we want to work in an office or work from home or have a hybrid work environment where we may work a couple days or a few days a week in the office, or we choose when we go into the office. And as we hear about people having this great reshuffle or the great resignation even, I think we're at a point where we need to decide what we really want and how we manage as organizations to the people that are making those choices. So for instance, if somebody is new to an organization, how do we onboard them? How do we make sure that they're ready for the culture? They're ready for what they need to do, their goals and objectives. Did we have those in place? In history, sales organizations had a pretty strong curriculum as far as onboarding goes. You need to really understand what you're trying to sell before you go out and sell it. But from a product perspective or from a customer service perspective, that doesn't happen nearly as much. There's some, but not nearly as much. So again, we're at a point where we're pivoting into this new day of understanding how we work from home, or do we want to work from home, or do we want to work from the office? In telecommuting in the past it's been around. I mean, that's not anything new, nor really is video meetings. If you really think about it, FaceTime has been here. In the past, there was a company called ACN, which was a multi-level marketing company that sold phones to the personal level, but they were selling it to business too. Avaya, Cisco, they all had these things, Jabber, WebEx. The technology was there. It just wasn't really adopted. But before the pandemic, roughly 5.7 million people were already telecommuting. And the definition of telecommuting to the census was greater than 2 days a week, having the option to work from home. During the pandemic, however, 69% of all the US office workers were now working from home. That accounted for roughly 50 million people, so 10 times that amount. And that's all these people working from home that weren't given a choice. They weren't given the opportunity to make that decision. It's not like that's necessarily a bad thing. It's better than, I guess, catching a virus outside. But these people did not have the opportunity to get ready. They didn't really understand what was happening. They just knew that they had to go home to work in order to secure their job. And then going forward, 70% of organizations so far has said that they would adopt some type of hybrid work environment. Whether or not that's fully remote or that's working from the office part of the time, that's over 70% of all global organizations that said that they would be working from home or from an office. What we found was that with the video collaboration tool, the shift was I'm now working from an office to now I'm working from home. However, this novel experience took off with the video collaboration tool. So video meeting platforms, whether it be Google Hangouts, Jabber, WebEx, Microsoft Teams, Zoom, these are all just examples of the platforms that exist. And what they saw in 2019 to 2020 was a surge, exactly the same as how many people were telecommuting versus how many people were now working from home. So just over this given period of time, I believe it was somewhere around like 300% user base and continually growing through 2020, 2021. What I saw in the Q4 release of Zoom's financials is that even in 2022, they expect a 30% growth. So that's monumental. That's saying that even though organizations have been locked down, they're still expecting that they're going to grow more in 2022. But at what cost? So what I found through some literature in 2019 and 2020 during the first pandemic, at the beginning of the pandemic, was that people felt this Zoom fatigue. They dubbed it Zoom fatigue. And what Zoom fatigue at that time was essentially, I had the same meetings as I did in 2019, and now in 2020 or late 2019, I'm feeling more tired. It's not like I'm having more meetings, but I'm more tired. They weren't able to identify necessarily exactly why they felt more tired. A little bit further down, 2020 into 2021, there was a few that did some research, and one of the research came back I found really interesting was that this person, Jeremy, found that there were 4 things qualitatively that really struck a chord with people. One is that if you're standing in front of a person, right now you're looking at me on video, but if you're standing in front of a person, imagine you're in an elevator and you're staring them in the face. It's kind of awkward, right? You feel a low level of stress. You see a lot of the verbal cues. You see their eye contact. You can kind of stare at their mouth a little bit. That was something that created more stress. Also, staring at yourself. So a lot of the platforms, the majority of the platforms, have a video of yourself while you're speaking to other people. And the level of self-consciousness that happens where you're staring at yourself, it creates a level of stress too. It's kind of like looking in the mirror all day long. Nonverbal cues also create this. You would think that nonverbal cues is a benefit to video conferencing, and I believe that is true, where I get to pick up on how you look, how you feel. Perhaps you kind of want to raise your hand a little bit. But what they found was that nonverbal cues is being exaggerated inside this little square that you're sitting in. So, it's this, I want to say 1.5 feet, 2 foot by 2 foot square. And normally you would be looking at one person at a time, and your verbal cues are pretty normal as far as like talking to somebody else, right? But inside a cube, you have to exaggerate it. Your face is a little bit more. Your hands have to go up in the air. That's inside this box. And the exaggeration does take additional work, and that's creating stress. And then lastly, he identified that mobility is something, in between meetings, you get a little time to decompress. You get to walk to the water cooler, get some water, or perhaps use a restroom. There's a lot of different things. For me, even I like to pace. I used to be in a sales org, and when I would talk to people, I like to pace. It helps me think. It helps me keep my mind off of things. It definitely helps me to not multitask at a computer. So what they found was that mobility has a component to this level of stress as well. And so all of this being said, what I tried to do during my study was understand what those experiences are while they were working from home. Again, using video meeting platforms. So that was an important component to what I was trying to study. And then looking at what that burnout may be. How are people feeling like burnout? What is burnout? And what's causing burnout that everybody keeps saying that Zoom fatigue or the video meetings is causing the burnout? What's there? What's in between that? The qualitative study that I just mentioned earlier, it's mentioning some things. I can see that there's some like cognition usage because they're having to think about themselves, or there are certain levels of stress, or all these different things. And perhaps even time when we're talking about not being able to even go to the restroom or get water. But what are those factors? That's what I was trying to do. And the way I approached this was based on some theories that were in the past. And what those theories were is essentially economics, supply and demand. In this case, we're looking at how a person feels, and it's not the economic of life, but in this case, we would call it like resource theories. So there is a demand and there is a resource. A demand is essentially a physical or a psychological component of a person or an organization that would be taking, right? It's what would cause a person to feel more tired, or what would take more energy. That's a demand. And then of course the offset of that is a resource. Resource would be giving things that would reduce their demands or would take care of the demands that are happening. In the case of resource and in the theory here, there's also a component of like personal growth, maybe organizational growth and development. And to people, they feel like if they're progressing, they would get resource. That is a resource to them. And so what we found was that there were two really important theories here. One is conservation of resource theory, and the other one is job demand resource theory. And what this is saying is, as demands increase, resources need to be there too. If resources aren't there, then two things will happen. Either they feel burnout, or they're going to end up pulling back and try to conserve the resources that they have already. So again, what's happening is really intuitive if we think about it. There's more demand, and somebody's going to have to change either the amount of resources that happen, or they're going to start, shriveling up and saying, "Hey, I'm not going to use any more of my energy. I need to save that for something else that's more important." And so how I did that was I went through a mixed method theory, or a mixed method design. And what that is you go through a qualitative side, so you're interviewing people. I use semi-structured interviews. In this, it was a very specific type of interview process. It's phenomenology. So what you're doing is you're asking a question, you're asking an open-ended question, semi-structured. So that means that you're really trying to grab at what those things that are happening. And I'll discuss that in a second. Analyze that data. There's something called grounded theory that I use, where essentially you're coding it. You're taking what people are telling you and you're validating it, and then you're coming back and saying, "Oh, well, this is what they're saying here. Is that what you're saying?" And then keep on doing that over and over and over until you get to what I consider saturation, and we can come up with themes. And that's what I did with the qualitative side. I created themes, and then again, more themes, and then consolidate them into what we're trying to find, what we're trying to observe. And then I took all of that and created what my theory was, what a model looks like, and went out for a survey and surveyed a bunch of people. Total respondent number was around 480, and analyzed that data to say, okay, well, what we found in the qualitative side and what we saw in past research, is that what we're finding here? Remember, this is a really novel research, because there has been a lot on telecommuting, but there really hasn't been that much on telecommuting and using virtual meetings as a platform. How do those two work together? How do they exist? And what does that mean for organizations? So how I did that was I tried to uncover what burnout looked like first, and then unlocking those experiences over time. Similar to what we saw in the theory, what was happening with people was they were coping. So the demands went up. Maybe let's just say we had kids around, and I think there's been plenty of videos out on this, and even like memes and funny skits where you have kids around and they come in while you're in the middle of a meeting. What do? You hold them. You make sure they're not crying. I remember the video was, oh, well, this kid comes in the middle of an interview or whatnot, and he's in his underwear, and so what do you do with that? You had enough of it. I can't take it anymore, right? And so what you do is you put a note on the door. You tell the kids, if this note is up, don't come in. And that is what I consider coping. So that can happen with a lot of different things. That is reducing how you feel to burnout. And how I got this was I asked these people, okay, so how have you been affected by telecommuting? How has video conferencing technology impacted you? How do you feel? Do you feel burnout? If you do feel burnout, what's causing the burnout? Is there anything in between that's causing that burnout feeling? And how can you change in order to reduce the burnout? So that's the coping mechanism. And just using those, you're able to gather what people are feeling and where changes are happening. And what I got from that was, well, people really looked at video meeting usage in a number of components. They're looking at how many hours they're spending on meetings, the number of meetings, whether or not their video is on during the meeting, and how much speaking they have. And with that, they were also feeling conflict. They felt time conflict. So time conflict would be, when I wake up in the morning, do I need to be on the video, right? I am now in a global organization where I used to be asynchronous communication, now it's all synchronous. Is that a problem? Work-family conflict is kids coming in. Environmental conflict is the lawnmower blowing outside. While you're in the middle of a meeting, you can't hear anybody, or maybe they hear that. There's also a level of economy utilization. We described this quite a bit. It's looking at yourself in the mirror, blue screen, having to pay attention to more things, perhaps looking at a deck while you're looking at a person's face, or 20 people's faces for that matter. What people felt also was that there was a level of uncertainty during this time, insecurities of their job, uncertainty of how to perform their job. One comment that I heard a lot is, well, I'm over here looking at my Zoom and talking to people, but my instant messenger has gone inactive. How are people viewing me? Or how are people looking at my background? Are they judging me? Those are all uncertainties that people were feeling. And really interesting is that having that extra cognition usage through uncertainty, making it even more strong, people were starting to isolate themselves. They felt a level of professional isolation. They thought their meetings were really tactical. There wasn't any discussion. There wasn't any pre-meeting talk. There wasn't anything about personal life. They got so tired during the day that they didn't even want to network. These so-called happy hours were a burden now. And so, the isolation component really played a role in this lockdown environment and with video meetings, because they were feeling more tired from the video meetings. And these all led to the feeling of burnout. And burnout here is a classical burnout where people are feeling tired, exhausted, famished. They have a level of disassociation. They're pulling away. In this, they also have depersonalization. They're not too sure what their job is, what their role is. And most importantly, and a very strong component is they felt amnesia. They were going from meetings to meetings, not even knowing what they just talked about, what they just heard. They weren't really understanding all of this. And what I look back on literature is there were a lot of things that pointed at this. I'm going to go through this fairly quickly, but people were already multitasking during telecommuting. They were at home, nobody was staring over their shoulders, and a lot of students in this case were multitasking and they felt more stressed. They also felt like when they were telecommuting that they were isolated from home. Think about it, even back in the sales days, there were things to offset that. Let's bring people in. Let's have meetings together. Let's talk about what sales successes we have. Let's go to a national sales conference. Are these activities still happening within the organization beyond sales? Not so much. And so people were feeling like they were isolated already in telecommuting without even video meeting conferences. Interesting point is conflict, because most of the research out there talking about conflict in telecommuting is a negative relationship. People felt less conflict with home, work, family, things like that when they were telecommuting, because they were able to be at home a little more. They were able to throw the laundry in early in the morning and throw it in the dryer and not have to do that at night. Maybe they weren't spending much time with it, but at least they got some of those things done. And so they were feeling less conflict. However, there was a study that was done where telecommuting was a lot greater, and they found that the physical boundaries weren't there anymore, and they were permeating into the work-life balance. And so there was, I guess, an inverse U-curve, as you may call it, with conflict. And then there's a level of uncertainty. A lot of people feel like uncertainty makes stress greater, and it's leading also to burnout. So in more recent studies, they found that asynchronous communication in global teams is slightly better than synchronous, because there's so much time conflict. To have a meeting with somebody in India, Australia, and let's just say France, it's very difficult. The timing, somebody's going to have to wake up really early, somebody's going to still have to be on late at night. Sometimes asynchronous communication really does work better for that, using things like Slack or Symphony. A lot of participants felt more fatigued in video meetings, and we already discussed that, but there wasn't too much study in this and why people felt fatigued. We also noticed that some of the studies out there are talking about job insecurities. We discussed this. With the pandemic, job insecurity was high, but uncertainty made it even worse. So that needed to be addressed. Synchronous learning was fine. I mean, people enjoyed synchronous learning, but as time progressed, a lot of the teachers to students noticed that people became less responsive. They were almost non-responsive, and the people that used to be very active in the classroom, they started showing signs of isolation. And this is all, these are mainly with students and medical students and things like that. It was a hot topic, especially during the lockdown. But all in all, Zoom usage in these studies, it was leading to feeling of burnout. And people were secluding themselves more than ever. And they were also paying attention to those nonverbal cues more than ever. And that was causing some problems. And so through all that, what I did was I went through the 488 surveys, came down, narrowed it down to 427. Nice range of folks, between 20 and 60 different ethnic groups, males and females. I had a nice split, a little bit more on the male side. Marital status all over the place, mostly married, however. And then we had a nice split of 40% or so people with children. One really interesting thing to point out was that 55% of the people that responded had no intention of ever working from home. I think that's important because as we see moving into the new day and age where people are choosing, 55% originally had no intention of working from home. And so what I found was that video meeting usage, it led a little bit to more cognitive utilization. It wasn't very statistically significant, but it did lead a little to it. Anything usage in general would lead to it. What usage did was it led to quite a bit of conflict. So if we think about this, any usage should lead to conflict. Being at home led to more conflict. Of course, being with video led to a different level of conflict. And so the conflicts were high. What we found through the whole entire study was that video on really didn't change the dynamic of how people felt as far as cognitive utilization and conflict of their own video on. And that could be that as people felt more comfortable with the video, they would turn it on. They're okay with turning it on. And the people that weren't, frankly, had it off. But what people were feeling was that when they had speaking roles, so a little bit of speaking role or some speaking role, they felt less of everything. They felt less conflict. They felt less cognitive utilization, and they felt less burnout. And that, in my mind, I didn't study this, but that could be that they felt like they weren't wasting their time because they were speaking in these meetings, or they felt like they were actually getting something out of it and they weren't multitasking, and maybe that wasn't causing as much cognitive utilization, and all these things leading to burnout. I guess if you're tired, you're going to be burnt out, and that's just natural. Cognition usage leading to burnout is how you feel. For professional isolation, people that were isolated didn't really get to the burnout feeling. They did feel isolation when there was more cognitive utilization. That was very significant. And the study showed that. What the study also showed is a large amount of conflict led to burnout. So just recapping that point is a lot of conflict led to burnout, a lot of cognitive utilization led to burnout. Isolation not necessarily as burnout, but that could be a component of what we were talking about earlier in the resource aspect, where as demands increase, resources need to be there, and if you're isolated, you won't be able to have much of the development. What was really interesting was that usage did not lead to burnout. As a matter of fact, it was negatively related. Just like the speaking roles or intensity of participation, it was negative to burnout. And what that's telling us is people really do enjoy using video meeting platforms, and that the burnout is negative to that. However, if conflict exists, if cognitive utilization is increased, if we're not attacking those things, then it can lead to burnout in a significant way. But by itself, it's not getting there. And so with that, I would say we have a few things to take away from this study is the number of meetings and hours does make people more tired. And from what we saw in the study and perception is that we need to limit how many meetings people have. Somewhere between maybe 2 and 3 is what more than half the respondents said they would like to be in meetings. Speaking roles is very important. It reduces conflict, it reduces cognitivization and burnout. So if we think about this, what we need to do is we need to be intentional about having participants in meetings that are part of the meeting and ask everybody what that relevancy is to them. Don't just throw people in meetings because we've been doing that. We've been having meetings for meetings to have meetings. And we need to really be intentional about who we include and what part they play in that meeting. Uncertainty leads to greater cognitivization. So we need to think about how we do with training, how we set expectations, those objectives and key results from top down. So I spoke about how that interpersonal distance or psychological distance is from like a CEO to a lower level versus middle manager to lower level. And so if we think about that dynamic, we need to be and have objectives that are really close from manager to individual contributor, where they know exactly what they're supposed to be doing, how they're viewed, how they're judged, as well as giving other people the insight into saying, oh, you know what, everybody's environment looks fine. Or if you don't feel comfortable with it, put a background on it and it's fine. Everybody is okay with that. Isolation leads to burnout moderately. Again, the component there is how do we offset the resources so that people feel like they're part of something, that they feel like they can have mobility within the organization. Cognitive utilization does lead to isolation significantly, a lot, and as well as burnout. So we really need to think about how we can reduce that cognitive utilization, whether or not we're turning off our own video in the meetings or maybe having smaller groups when we're having meetings. Those are all some of the things that we can do. Again, employees really like speaking. They want to be part of it. It also helps them reduce isolation. And then conflict, time, and environment lead to both burnout and environmental conflicts. And they all lead to amnesia. So reducing the conflict, if you have a room to stay in that room, it may feel isolation, but have that area where you can work, because that's going to be important to whether or not you feel like the amnesia is coming in, as well as having some time in between your meetings to recap, to think, to do your own work. And that plays hand in hand with how many meetings you have a day. If you only have 2 or 3 and you spread that out, then yeah, you can have time to understand what happened in that meeting. But if you have a lot of conflict time and you're back to back all day long, you can believe that you're not going to remember much of it. And then lastly, video meeting platforms reduces burnout. And so, with people, there may be different personalities, there may be different types of people, and they may like video meetings more than others will. But video meeting overall, it does reduce the feeling of burnout, and it makes a person feel better. We found that even during a qualitative study where individuals said, hey, I really enjoy this because these people I've never seen, I've talked to, and they're overseas, and I don't think I'll ever have the opportunity to talk to them. But now I'm able to do that, and it's really nice putting a face and being able to see the person smile, and et cetera, et cetera. And those are all good feelings. So, in a nutshell, this study really panned out as video meeting may not necessarily be the culprit of how people are feeling this quote unquote Zoom fatigue or virtual meeting platform fatigue. In reality, what we're seeing is that it can lead to different components. It can lead to conflict, more cognitivization, and uncertainty is making it worse. And those are all leading to isolation and then corresponding with how people feel as this burnout feeling, but not necessarily as a video meeting platform. I think there's an opportunity to study that a little bit more in a lot of fashions, but I'm just going to leave it at that, and hope you really found this insightful.